So this is me. I'm a father, a small business owner, and a member of the community. And this is also me.
We got Wicked on the main event in the corner. What's that? Oh! Corn Nuggets is gonna go for a powerbomb. Oh! Main event hanging. He's at,
So that's the main event Mike Daniel, a villainous, cowardly bad guy, or a heel as they call him in wrestling jargon. So how did I go from here to here? Tonight I want to share 3 stories with you. One is about a person I know, one is about a person I've met, and one is about a person I admire. And the bind is pro wrestling and what it's taught me. This is my grandma. She found me on her doorstep when I was 3 months old. And when I say on her doorstep, I mean literally, she found me on her doorstep. See, my mother had me at 16 and was a drug addict most of her life, until she died from the disease when she was 19. I never knew my dad, and my grandfather was an alcoholic and sort of in and out of our lives. So she was the only real constant I had in those early years. Now you can imagine how raising 2 kids, mostly alone on a fixed income, must have been tough. But my grandma persevered, something that was ingrained within her. You see, she was a Depression-era Dust Bowl refugee from the Texas Panhandle, a la the Grapes of Wrath. She undoubtedly worked hard but struggled along the way. But as I was a kid, I didn't know about these struggles. We always had plenty of food on the table, and all the things that you sort of need as a child, that sort of structure. We were poor, but I never really felt poor. What we lacked in money, we made up for her in her presence and structure she provided for me. We didn't have much money to do things, so we had to find something that was kind of a bond that would bring us together that didn't cost a bunch of money. So the one thing we had was TV. Her favorite thing to watch growing up was things like Wild Kingdom and these shows, so early Shark Week, think about this stuff. So on these 4x3 TVs, that was sort of her thing. That was her escape. She loved watching these shows. But we shared another escape together that she taught me about, which was pro wrestling. It was something we had in common, and it's kind of a weird thing to have in common with your grandma, right? Like, oh, pro wrestling, right? So we had this in common, and it was something that she and I would be able to talk about and connect together over, and it was one of the few times growing up that I actually saw her get truly happy. She would tell me stories about characters like Gorgeous George, Pat Patterson, and Ray the Crippler Stevens. She would see these guys do their thing at the Cow Palace and would just tell me all these crazy stories about being in the front row and seeing all these things as a kid. For me, growing up, my generation had Hulk Hogan, the Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior. Now, my grandma wasn't much for violence. She had seen plenty of this in her 4 different marriages. But there was something about wrestling that was always okay with her. So when I was a little boy, she would tell me about wrestling, the weirdest thing. She would say, you might learn something from it. Little did she know how right she was. I was lucky enough to have my grandma from the time I was 3 months old until I was 15. At 15, she ended up getting very sick, and I found myself on my own. So at 15 years old, I sort of started my life on my own, putting myself through high school on my own. At one point, even living in my friend's closet. Unbeknownst to his parents, by the way, we were able to pull this off. It was really, really kind of an impressive thing that we were able to do. But it was something that really sort of helped shape me at that time. And midway through my junior year, I found a group of kids who kind of came from the same background as me, and we shared a passion together. I bet you can guess what it is. Wrestling, yes, you're right. So we did something called backyard wrestling. And for those who are curious, what is backyard wrestling? We wrestled in a backyard. Not me, by the way. But our ragtag group, many of who came from the same sort of similar socioeconomic backgrounds, we saw wrestling as sort of an escape, For me, from sort of where my life was at 15, being on my own. For others, from poverty. For others, just really bad home life. So we came together with wrestling. And it was something that did something for me early on in my life that was really interesting. We took that passion and we started to build upon it. So we took this time on mattresses in the backyard and we ended up creating something with it. Started designing costumes. Started developing characters. And it was where I actually learned video production, and now I own a business that does this. I learned how to do it in the backyard. Wrestling on mattresses is how I learned how to do this. We had a public access TV show that aired in Stockton and Modesto for 3 years. My business partner and I met through this public access wrestling show 20 years ago. I'm going to share another story about the second man, Hawkeye Shane Kody. By the way, he does not know I'm talking about him tonight, nor can he probably point me out in a lineup. But Shane Kody comes from a wrestling lineage. He's the second-generation wrestler, the son of a promoter named Woody Farmer, who was a big promoter in the Bay Area in the 1960s, 1970s, and is also a part-time Hollywood actor. Shane Kody couldn't point me out in a lineup then or now, but he did something for me when I was just 20 years old that has stuck with me my adult life. So about 2 years into the backyard thing, I was like, you know what, this isn't really enough for me. I want to do something more, and several of us felt that way. So we took the mattresses and traded them in for pro wrestling school, becoming professional wrestlers. Did you guys know there was an actual thing called pro wrestling school? So I went to pro wrestling school. That's where I went to college, guys, was pro wrestling school. So they didn't offer sweaters. We didn't have a football team, nothing like that. But that was my university. But what pro wrestling school taught me about was sacrifice. Taught me a lot about what goes into just really toiling a little bit in life, I would say. Because what we would do is, once we were trained, then we were ready to go travel all over the West Coast for $20 in Elks Lodges, car dealership parking lots, and these sorts of things, just to get our head kicked in by guys like Shane Kody. So about 2 years into my wrestling journey, I was booked on a show for a promotion out of the Bay Area, and they're having a big show up in Eureka, Northern California. And it was a company that I really wanted to work for because they sort of had a 6-degree Kevin Bacon connection to the WWE, for those who are familiar with this. Now, my 5'8", 160-pound body thought at that time, hey, I can make it to WWE, why not? So I was booked on this show. I got to know the promoter. He became a little bit familiar with my background doing video production, things like that. So he would hire me to produce commercials for their promotion. And what he would do is say, well, since you're doing this for us, why don't you come wrestle on our shows? So I wrestle on their shows. So I was working very low on the undercard, meaning that I was very bottom of the totem pole. But, you know, I'm doing commercials for this guy. I'm feeling pretty good. I learned so much, you know, over my couple of years. I was bringing all this with me. And I made a mistake that I have not forgot to this day. So you see, Shane Kody was the promoter's henchman, meaning that every locker room in wrestling has someone who's kind of watching the locker room to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to with these sort of quiet, unwritten rules you know nothing about, frankly, especially if you're as new and as green and as mouthy as I am. So the story goes, I was booked on the show, and there was this wrestler named Le Empereur, who was a diminutive French character a la Napoleon. I wanted him on one of my shows. At this point now, I'm booking shows up here in the Modesto area. I've promoted shows a mile away from here. So I wanted him on this show. So I have a conversation with him, thinking nothing of it, right? You know, I'm gonna book Le Empereur, no big deal. So I have this conversation with him, go sit down to get ready for my match, and the promoter comes up to me screaming. He's like, what are you doing? This is my locker room. You don't go out there and talk to my wrestlers, blah, 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 right? So I'm like, I don't know what's happening here. I'm getting yelled at by this dude, and all I see is Shane Kody looking at me, probably about 10 feet away the whole time. So I say to myself, okay, I just got yelled at by the promoter in front of the entire locker room. This can't be good for me. What does this mean? So, you know, I let him do his thing. He yells at me, and then eventually he says, you know, I think he's going to kick me out, right? I mean, the assumption would be, get out of my locker room, go home. He says, it's cool, get ready for the battle royal. And for those of you who don't know what a battle royal is, it's you get a bunch of wrestlers, the whole locker room, in a ring to throw someone over the top rope. The last person wins, right? So I think to myself, okay, he didn't kick me out. I'm clearly dumb to him, but I'm not stupid. And Shane Kody's staring at me. What does this mean? So I say to myself, I have a couple options. Either one, I just put on my clothes and get out of there. Or two, I stick around and see what happens. So being 20, I say to myself, okay, I'm going to stick around. So I stay for the show. So the villainous coward, or the villainous main event Mike Daniel, usually walks like this. I must have looked like this walking to the ring. I mean, I was just probably white as a ghost. So we get into the ring. The bell rings. About 10 feet away from me, there's a 20 by 20, the rings are 20 by 20. I see Shane Kody. And I'm like, this dude's coming for me. I just feel it. So you remember in Chariots of Fire, has anyone seen that movie when the person's moving really slow? That's what he looked like coming at me with his cowbell. I'm like, this can't be good. So as he comes at me, someone else jumps in the way, takes the cowbell right to his head, busts him open. And not fake, like really busts his head open. So he does that. Then he gets up, and then that wrestler throws me out of the ring. And I'm like, okay, what just happened here? This is super weird. I don't know why he hit him, not me. Like, I'm not really following, right? So I get backstage, and I go up to this wrestler, and I say to him, like, hey, man, like, why did you take that for me? And he said something to me that really stuck out. He said, did you learn something? Didn't really know what he meant. So I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I learned that I didn't get hit, and that's great. So I wait for Shane Kody to go and sit down. And Shane wasn't exactly what we call a talker. He doesn't look like he's the most gregarious guy on the planet. So I go up to him, and I for whatever reason, I was kind of outside of myself at this point. I go up to him, and I put out my hand, and I say, thank you. And he sort of looks down. Then he sort of looks up. And then he says to me, kid, did you learn something? I did learn something, which I'll share a little bit here later. So the third person I want to talk about is someone I've never met, but I admire dearly. Who's heard of the Nature Boy Ric Flair? See, this is my kind of crowd. So for those who do not know how to woo, the Nature Boy Ric Flair is sort of an icon in professional wrestling. Let's call him our Michael Jordan. Multi-time world champion. Been in the wrestling business for over 40 years. Just someone who's really sort of looked upon as an idol. He was someone that I looked up to as a child because he was everything I wasn't. He was jet flying, limousine riding. He had all these things that I wanted to have in life but didn't have. I was immediately drawn to him. He had a posse. He had all the things that I wanted to be, but I just wasn't. The interesting thing that I learned about Ric Flair is just how much alike he and I truly were. Just like me, he was abandoned as a child. So he was raised, he was adopted, where I was in a different situation. But he used athletics and his lifestyle to create sort of this persona and this gimmick that really helped him through at a young age. And then it carried on into his later life. Not too long ago, he ended up changing his lifestyle, though. There was something about him that was part of his character, but not necessarily something that was known that was a big part of who he was. He had a problem with drinking. And it was something that ultimately started taking over his life to the point where he almost actually died from complications to drinking. It was something that really sort of came home for me because I've also, too, suffered with alcoholism. So I understand what Ric Flair had went through, and to see someone who comes from a similar background that I do, who's someone I really looked up to, who had the same problems I did, really made me think to myself that, we're not all that much different. So I look at Ric Flair, who's my idol, and I see a lot of myself. He started with nothing, no education, and he ended up becoming something big. That ended up happening for me in my own way, too. I started out poor, but I was able to grow a career and eventually own my own business, which is something I'm very proud of and being an active part of the community. So what I took from the lessons learned by my grandma, Shane Kody, and Ric Flair began to lay together what lessons did I learn and how do I apply them to my life. So I want to share three lessons that I learned from them. The first one is you're going to take bumps. Tuck your chin. So there's this term in wrestling, when you take a bump and you fall, you'll notice people put their head in like this. It's called tucking your chin. And what that really means is protect your head, right? Because you never know if the next bump isn't going to be your last. So we all take bumps. In wrestling, you'll take 50 plus per match. So one of the things that I learned is to take a bump, keep myself safe, and then get back up. I had plenty of times in my life where I took those bumps and I got back up. I didn't let them be my last bump. Second is that wrestling and life are team sports. I can't remember the guy who took that cowbell shot. I really don't know. He could be here right now and be like, dude, that was me, that was me. I never saw him again. I can't repay him. But he and Kody taught me something that night that still stuck with me for many years. We're playing a team sport, and the actions of others impact your life and vice versa. I've learned to work as a team, and I'll be protected. As a small business owner and a father, I think all the time about how my actions directly affect my team. And I never want them taking the cowbell shot for me. And the third part is knowing and trusting your character. Ric Flair taught me that the outwardly confident people may be fighting some battles that we don't know. That, if we're scared of something sometime, we need to work through that. Living in fear is our own creation. It's something we frankly can't control. So I've learned not to fear who I am and to embrace what makes me who I am. I'm uneducated, but I'm experienced. I'm short, but I stand tall. I'm nerdy, but I think I'm my own brand of cool. Whether anyone agrees with my characterization of myself is irrelevant. I know who I am, and I'm comfortable in my own skin. And most importantly, something I want to share for you guys tonight is to be comfortable in your own skin. No, I'm not stripping, by the way, guys. Okay, so I may not have the body I had 20 years ago, but those bumps and bruises along the way brought me here. I'm confident. I feel good in my own skin. This may be the last time, by the way, I ever stand in my underwear in front of a group of people ever again. But if I do, it's the most confident and prepared I'll ever be. I challenge you to find that moment within yourself. What's your cowbell moment? What's your underwear moment? Thank you.